Imagine hearing your own best friend scream, "There he is! Shoot the traitor!" Imagine running through the snow, not from the enemy, but from your own brothers. For Silas Vance, this wasn't a nightmare, it was his reality. He was about to be executed by the same men he was trying to save. They thought he was a coward. They thought he had abandoned them in the middle of the night to save his own skin. But while his unit was busy hunting him down, Silas was the only thing standing between them and a bloodbath. He had to choose, let his reputation die so his friends could live. The year was 1944. The place was the Ardennes Forest. It was a place where the trees were so thick they blocked out the sun. It was a place where the fog was so heavy you could not see your own hand in front of your face. Most people remember this as the time of a great battle, but today we are not talking about generals or maps. We are talking about a ghost. His name was Silas Vance. To his enemies, he was a shadow. To his friends, he was a coward. To his country, he was a traitor. But what if the person everyone hates is the only person who can save them? In war, you are taught to follow orders. You are taught that the man in charge knows best. If you walk away from your post, you are a deserter. You lose your honor. You lose your right to be called a soldier. Silas Vance knew this. He knew that by leaving his bunk in the middle of the night, he was signing his own death warrant. He didn't leave because he was scared of the Germans. He left because he was scared for his friends. 50 men were sleeping in a camp nearby. 50 men with families. 50 men who were waiting for the order to march. They ignored his warnings. They laughed at his fear. They told him to go back to sleep. But Silas could not sleep. He could hear something in the distance. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the snow. It was the sound of heavy iron. It was the sound of a trap being set. This is the story of a secret mission that no one asked for. It is the story of a man who chose to be hated so that others could live. Before the sun rose on that cold December morning, Silas Vance would find something in the woods that would change history. But first, he had to survive the loneliness of being a man without a country.
Who was Silas Vance? He was not a hero from a comic book. He was a quiet man from a small town. He was the kind of person you'd walk past on the street and never notice. In the army, he was a scout. His job was to look, to listen, and to stay hidden. Silas had a gift. Some called it a sixth sense. Others called it shell shock. He could feel danger before it happened. He noticed the way the birds stopped singing. He noticed the way the mud felt under his boots. While other soldiers talked about home or complained about the food, Silas watched the tree line. But this gift was also his curse. In a world of loud explosions and screaming orders, a quiet man is often ignored. His officers thought he was paranoid. They thought the war had broken his mind. They saw a man who shook when the wind blew too hard. They didn't see a man whose body was reacting to a threat they couldn't see yet. His objective was simple, but impossible. Prove that Sector 4 was a graveyard. Sector 4 was a valley. On the maps, it was marked as clear. The high-ranking officers said the German army was retreating. They said the path was safe for the convoy, but Silas knew better. Every time he looked toward that valley, his blood ran cold. He didn't have photos. He didn't have proof. He only had his gut feeling. He had 50 lives on his shoulders. That was his real objective. Not a medal, not a promotion, just the hope that 50 men would see their mothers again. But to reach that objective, Silas had to face his greatest fear, being alone. Silas Vance was a man who loved his unit. He loved the brotherhood of the army. Now he had to walk away from it. He had to become a ghost. He had to step into the darkness of the forest with nothing but a rifle and a bag of stolen explosives. He knew that if he failed, he would die as a nobody. If he succeeded, he might still be shot as a traitor before he could tell his story. The psychological weight was crushing. Every step he took away from the camp felt like a step toward a cliff. His heart hammered against his ribs. The silence of the forest felt like a scream. He was cold. He was terrified. He was labeled a criminal. But he kept moving because Silas Vance had a mission, and he was the only one brave enough to finish it.
Captain Miller was not a villain. He was an honest man. He was a brave man. But in the military, honesty and bravery are often tied to a map. And according to Miller's map, Sector 4 was empty. The conflict began in a small, damp tent. The smell of wet wool and cheap tobacco filled the air. Silas stood before the captain. He was shaking, but not from the cold. He was shaking because he knew the truth. "Captain," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, "the valley is not clear. I heard them. I heard the Tiger tanks. I heard the German crews talking." Miller didn't even look up from his desk. He was under a different kind of pressure. High-ranking officers were breathing down his neck. They wanted the convoy to move. They wanted results. To Miller, Silas was just a tired scout who was seeing ghosts in the fog. "Vance," the captain replied, his voice like grinding stones. "The scouts before you saw nothing. The air reconnaissance saw nothing. You're exhausted. Go lie down." This was the wall. It was a wall of paper and ink. Miller trusted the reports. Silas trusted his ears. The conflict wasn't just about a road. It was about two different ways of seeing the world. One man saw a safe path to a strategic town. The other man saw a slaughterhouse. The clock was ticking. The convoy was scheduled to move at 0500. 50 men were already checking their gear. They were laughing. They were dreaming of a hot meal in the next town. Silas looked at their faces and saw dead men walking. He tried one last time. He begged. He pleaded. But Miller's patience snapped. He told Silas that if he spoke about imaginary tanks again, he would be stripped of his rank. In that moment, Silas realized a terrible truth. You cannot save people who do not believe they are in danger. To save them, he had to go against the very person he was supposed to protect. He had to choose between his duty to the captain and his duty to the lives of his friends. The real conflict of war is often not between two armies. Sometimes it is between a man's conscience and his orders. Silas Vance chose his conscience, and that choice turned him into an enemy of the state. When Silas stepped out of the camp and into the tree line, the world changed. The forest was no longer just a place, it was an enemy. The first obstacle was the cold. It was not a normal cold. It was a deep, biting frost that felt like needles under her skin.
It was the kind of cold that makes your bones feel brittle. Silas had to move slowly. If he sweat, the moisture would freeze and kill him. If he stayed still, his heart would slow down and he would never wake up. Then came the fog. The Ardennes fog is famous for a reason. It is thick, it is heavy, it tastes like wet metal. It hides everything. Silas was a scout, but even he was lost in the white void. He had to navigate by touch and by memory. Every tree looked like a German soldier. Every rustle of a branch sounded like a rifle bolt. But the physical obstacles were nothing compared to the psychological ones. As Silas moved deeper into the woods, he heard the sounds of the camp behind him. He heard the whistles. He heard the shouts. They had found his empty bunk. They knew he was gone. He heard his own name being shouted, but it wasn't a call for help. It was a call for a traitor. He was now a man hunted by both sides. If a German patrol found him, they would kill him as an invader. If an American patrol found him, they would shoot him as a deserter. He was trapped in a no-man's land of his own making. He felt the crushing weight of loneliness. He thought about his mother back home. What would she think when she got the letter? The letter wouldn't say her son died a hero. It would say her son ran away when things got tough. It would say he died in shame. Fear is a loud emotion. It screamed in his ears. It told him to turn back. It told him to lie and say he got lost. But then he remembered the faces of the 50 men in the convoy. He heard the young private who had shared his chocolate bar with him the night before. He pushed through the deep snow. The snow was an obstacle too. It was knee-deep and heavy. It acted like a trap, pulling at his boots, trying to tire him out. His fingers went numb. He could no longer feel the trigger of his rifle. He had to tuck his hands under his armpits just to keep the blood flowing. He was hungry, he was freezing, and he was alone. The forest wanted him to die. His own army wanted him arrested. But Silas Vance had a secret. He knew what was waiting in Sector 4, and that knowledge was the only thing keeping him warm. To understand why Silas was so afraid, you have to understand the map of 1944. The Allies were winning. They had pushed the German army back across France. The war felt like it was almost over. In the minds of the generals, the German army was a broken machine. They thought the enemy was too weak to fight back. Because of this, the Ardennes Forest was called a quiet sector. It was the place where they sent tired units to rest. It was the place where they sent new soldiers to learn. No one expected a battle here. The forest was too thick. The roads were too narrow. The weather was too bad. But the Germans were not resting. While the Allies were celebrating, the German army was gathering its last bit of strength. They were planning a massive surprise attack. History would later call this the Battle of the Bulge. Sector 4 was the perfect place for a trap. It was a narrow valley with steep hills on both sides. If you were in the bottom of that valley, you were a sitting duck. There was no way to run left and no way to run right. There was only the road ahead. The Allies did not have enough scouts. They did not have enough planes in the air because of the fog. They were moving blindly. They were sending a convoy of 50 men into a bottleneck. These men were not carrying heavy weapons. They were carrying wounded soldiers. They were carrying supplies. They were sitting in trucks with thin canvas roofs. Against them, the Germans had placed their best weapons. The Tiger tank was a monster of steel. Its armor was so thick that most Allied guns could not scratch it. And the 88mm gun was the most feared weapon of the war. It could hit a target from miles away
with deadly accuracy. This was the exposition of a disaster. All the pieces were in place for a massacre. The generals were confident. The captain was following orders. The soldiers were laughing. Only one man, a lonely scout with no power, knew that the quiet sector was about to become a graveyard.
Silas Vance was not born for war. He was born for the woods of Kentucky. Back home, he was the boy who could track a deer for miles without making a sound. He didn't learn how to listen from a military manual. He learned it from his grandfather. "The woods talk to you, Silas," his grandfather used to say. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear them." In the army, this made Silas different. He was not a tough guy. He didn't boast about how many enemies he would kill. He was the man who sat by the fire and watched the shadows. He noticed the way the wind changed direction. He noticed when the birds flew away for no reason. This is why he heard the heavy iron in Sector 4. To a normal soldier, a loud noise is just noise, but to Silas, every sound had a meaning. He knew the difference between the sound of a tree breaking under snow and the sound of a metal track crushing a rock. His character was built on a foundation of quiet observation, but this also made him a target for bullying. Other soldiers called him spooky. They thought his silence was a sign of weakness. They thought he was a coward because he didn't join in their loud games. The psychological struggle for Silas was the feeling of being invisible. He was a man who saw the truth, but no one saw him. He was a man who loved his country, but his country's rules were now his greatest enemy. Deep down, Silas was a man of simple faith. He believed that life was sacred. He didn't care about the politics of the war. He didn't care about the borders on a map. He cared about the 50 men in his unit. He felt like a big brother to all of them, even the ones who made fun of him. His fear was not about dying. His fear was about failing. He imagined the faces of the families back home. He imagined the telegrams being delivered. That thought was more painful than any bullet. Silas Vance was a quiet man, but inside his heart there was a fire of protection. He was a scout who had found his purpose, even if he had to lose his honor to achieve it. Silas was no longer walking. He was crawling. The snow was so deep that standing up made him a target. He moved like a shadow through the trees. Every few minutes, he would stop. He would press his ear to the frozen ground. Then he saw it, a faint line in the snow. To a normal person, it was nothing, but to Silas, it was a tire track, a heavy tire track. He followed it slowly. The track led him to an old ruined farmhouse at the edge of the valley. On the outside, the house looked dead. The windows were broken. The roof was covered in snow. There was no smoke from the chimney. But Silas saw something else. He saw the way the snow had been brushed away from the barn doors. He saw the faint smell of diesel fuel in the air. He crawled closer. His heart was beating so hard he thought the Germans would hear it. He reached the side of the barn and looked through a small crack in the wood. His breath stopped. Inside the barn were 2 Tiger tanks. They were painted in winter camouflage. They were silent and waiting. Beside them were dozens of German soldiers. They weren't resting. They were loading shells into the cannons. They were cleaning their rifles. Then Silas looked up at the roof of the farmhouse. He realized the most terrifying part of the trap. The roof was held up by hidden cables. With one pull, the roof would collapse and the walls would fall away. The farmhouse would disappear, and in its place would be a fortress of heavy guns. It was an invisible ambush. If the convoy drove down the road, they would be less than 50 yards away when the walls fell. They wouldn't even have time to scream. Silas felt a wave of cold fear. He was just one man with a light rifle. He was looking at a small army. He knew he had to go back and tell the captain. But then he looked at his watch. It was 04:30. The convoy was starting its engines right now. He was 3 miles away. He would never make it in time. The development of the story had reached its most dangerous point. Silas was no longer just a scout. He was the only barrier between 50 men and a massacre. While Silas was staring into the enemy eyes, something very different was happening back at the Allied camp. This is where the story becomes truly painful. It was 03 a.m. Captain Miller stood by Silas's empty bunk. He was shaking with rage. He had a million things to worry about, and now he had a deserter. "I knew it," one of the other soldiers whispered. "Vance always had a yellow streak down his back. He ran as soon as he heard a twig snap." The men Silas was trying to save were now making fun of him. They were calling him a coward. They were laughing about how he probably ran all the way back to the coast. To them, Silas was the villain of the story. He was the man who abandoned his brothers when they needed him most. Captain Miller sat down and wrote a note in the official logbook. He wrote the words, "Private Silas Vance, deserter, status, traitor." Miller then gave a direct order to the guards at the edge of the camp. "If you see Vance, do not ask questions. Shoot on sight. We have no room for cowards in this unit." This is the power of dramatic irony. The audience knows that Silas is currently freezing in the mud, staring at tiger tanks to save these very men, but the men think he is a criminal. The soldiers began to load into the trucks. They were joking around. They were talking about the girls they wanted to marry after the war. They felt safe. They felt protected by their captain and their maps. Every time a soldier laughed, it was a knife in the heart of the truth. They were mocking the only man who was actually doing his job. They were heading toward a trap, and they were cursing the only person who could stop it. The psychological struggle for Silas was now at its peak. He didn't know exactly what they were saying, but he knew they would hate him. He knew his reputation was being destroyed. He was alone in the dark, surrounded by enemies, while his friends were waiting to shoot him. He had every reason to walk away. He could have slipped into the woods and saved himself. Why die for people who call you a traitor? Why save a captain who wants you shot? But Silas Vance didn't move. He stayed in the shadows of the farmhouse. He looked at the explosives in his bag. He looked at the headlights of the convoy appearing in the distance. He made his choice. He would be the villain they hated, as long as it meant they stayed alive to hate him. Silas reached into his satchel. His fingers were so cold they felt like wooden sticks. Inside the bag were the blocks of TNT he had stolen from the camp's supply tent. At the time, he didn't know why he took them. Maybe it was an instinct. Maybe he knew that words wouldn't be enough to stop a tank. He looked at the farmhouse one last time. He had a plan, but it was a suicide mission. He didn't just want to blow up the house. He wanted to create a signal that could be seen for miles. He needed to turn this invisible trap into a giant burning lighthouse. Silas began to move. He crawled toward the rear of the barn, where the tiger tanks were idling. The smell of diesel was strong here. He found a stack of wooden crates filled with German shells. This was the planning. If he could blow these up, the entire farmhouse would go with it. He worked in total silence. Every time a German soldier walked past, Silas pressed his face into the freezing mud. He held his breath until his lungs burned. He planted the first charge on the main fuel tank. He planted the second on the ammunition crates. He checked the wires. Everything was ready. But he had a problem. He didn't have a long-distance remote. He had to be close to the blast to make sure it happened at the exact right moment. This was the layoff. In storytelling, you show the tools early so the ending makes sense. The explosives were the tool. Silas's bravery was the spark. He settled into a small crawl space under the floorboards. He waited. He watched the road. The headlights were closer now. He could hear the hum of the American truck engines. They were 5 minutes from the kill zone. Silas gripped the detonator. He was no longer thinking about the captain or the traitor label. He was only thinking about the 50 souls on that road. He was ready to trade his life for theirs.
The tension in the air was so thick you could almost touch it. Inside the farmhouse, the German commander raised his hand. His soldiers took their positions at the windows. The Tiger tanks groaned as they shifted into gear. They were waiting for the first Allied truck to reach the bridge. Silas could see the lead truck. It was a Jeep. Behind it were the transport trucks, filled with his friends. They were driving slowly because of the fog. They had no idea that dozens of cannons were aimed at their hearts. Just as the German commander was about to drop his hand to give the order to fire, a floorboard creaked. A German guard turned around. He saw Silas. "Amerikaner!" the guard screamed. The silence was shattered. Rifles began to bark. Bullets tore through the wood around Silas. He felt a sharp pain in his shoulder, but it didn't stop. He lunged for the detonator cord. "For the unit!" Silas roared. He pulled the cord. The world turned white. A massive fireball erupted from the center of the farmhouse. The ammunition crates exploded in a chain reaction. The Tiger tanks were lifted off the ground by the force of the blast. The roof of the house didn't just collapse, it was blown into 1,000 pieces. The fog was instantly burned away by the heat. The invisible fortress was gone. In its place was a giant roaring bonfire that lit up the entire valley. On the road, Captain Miller slammed on the brakes. The entire convoy skidded to a halt. The soldiers jumped out of the trucks, rifles ready. They looked ahead and saw the burning wreckage of the German ambush. They saw the Tiger tanks, now twisted metal. If they had driven 500 yards further, they would have been caught in the blast. Or worse, they would have been shredded by the German guns. The culmination was complete. The trap was destroyed. The resolution started with a stunned silence. Miller looked at the fire and then at his map. There was no farmhouse on his map. There were no tanks on his map. But there they were, burning in front of him. "Who did that?" Miller whispered. One of the soldiers pointed toward the ruins. "Look, someone is moving in the foxhole near the barn." The convoy didn't move forward into the trap. Instead, they moved forward to see who had saved them. They didn't find a traitor. They found a miracle. The world was no longer cold. It was screaming with heat. Silas lay in the mud, 30 feet from the center of the explosion. The sound had been so loud that his ears were ringing. He couldn't hear the wind. He couldn't hear the shouting. He only heard a high-pitched whistle that seemed to come from inside his own head. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and sulfur. The black smoke rose into the white sky, cutting through the fog like a dark sword.
German soldiers were running everywhere. Their perfect trap was now a perfect disaster. They weren't looking for Silas anymore. They were trying to escape the burning farmhouse before the rest of the ammunition cooked off. One of the Tiger tanks was a skeleton of fire. Its massive turret had been blown 10 feet into the snow. Silas tried to move. A sharp, hot pain flared in his shoulder. He looked down and saw his jacket was soaked in dark blood. A piece of flying wood or metal had found him. He felt weak. He felt heavy. The snow around him was turning pink. But he couldn't stay there. The heat of the fire was melting the ice, turning the ground into a swamp of freezing mud and hot ash. He used his good arm to drag himself toward a small foxhole under a fallen pine tree. Every inch was a struggle. His vision was blurring. He saw the world in flashes: orange fire, white snow, black smoke. Suddenly, the action changed. The American convoy had arrived at the edge of the clearing. They didn't come in trucks this time. They came on foot, moving in a tactical line. They saw the German survivors and opened fire. The valley was filled with the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of machine guns. Silas watched it all like he was in a dream. He saw Captain Miller leading the charge. He saw his friends, the men who had called him a coward, diving into the snow to fight the very enemy Silas had exposed. The activity was chaotic. It was violent. But to Silas, it was beautiful, because his friends were fighting. They weren't dying in their trucks. They were soldiers again. They had a fighting chance. Silas closed his eyes as the sound of the battle faded into the background. He had done his job. The ghost could finally rest.
Why do we follow rules? Most of the time, we follow them because they keep us safe. They keep things in order. But Silas Vance's story teaches us a difficult lesson. Sometimes, the rules are the greatest danger of all. The theme of this story is moral courage. Most people think courage is about running into gunfire, and it is. But there is another kind of courage that is much harder to find. It is the courage to be hated. It is the courage to let your friends think you are a loser, a coward, or a traitor, because you know something they don't. Silas was a man caught between two loyalties. He was loyal to the army, which said stay in your bunk, and he was loyal to his brothers who were in danger. He chose his brothers. In the military, duty usually means doing what you are told. But true duty means doing what is right, even if it costs you everything. He was willing to die twice. He was willing to die by a German bullet in the woods, and he was willing to die by an American firing squad for desertion. Loneliness is a recurring theme in the life of a hero. True heroes are rarely cheered while they are doing the work. They are usually doubted. They are usually mocked. They work in the shadows, in the fog, and in the Sector 4s of the world where no one else wants to go. The ghost of Sector 4 reminds us that the truth doesn't care about your rank. It doesn't care about what is written on a map. The truth only cares about who is brave enough to see it. Silas Vance was a quiet man who broke the law to save the people who made the law. He proved that one man, without power, without a title, and without a voice, can change the fate of 50 families. He showed us that being a traitor to a bad plan is the only way to be a hero for a good cause. As the smoke cleared over the Ardennes, one thing was certain. The man they wanted to shoot was the only reason they were still alive to pull the trigger. A great story is like a circle.
It ends where it began, but everything has changed. This story began in the silence of a cold bunk. It began with Silas Vance feeling like an outsider. He was the man no one listened to. He was the man who felt the weight of a disaster that hadn't happened yet. Think back to that first moment. Silas was looking at a map with his captain. To the captain, that map was the truth. To Silas, the map was a lie. Now look at the end. The silence has returned to the Ardennes Forest, but it is a different kind of silence. It is the silence of a battle that is over. The smoke is still drifting through the trees, and the snow is still falling, covering the black scars of the explosion. The unity of this story is found in the label. At the start, the label was Traitor. It was written in a logbook. It was whispered in the tents. By the end, that label has been burned away by the fire Silas started. Silas Vance didn't change. He was the same quiet man at the beginning as he was at the end. He didn't become a different person. He just stayed true to himself while the rest of the world was wrong. The forest, which was once his enemy, is now his protector. The snow, which tried to freeze him, is now cooling his wounds. The unit that wanted to shoot him is now the unit that is carrying him on a stretcher. Everything has come full circle. The man who walked into the woods as a criminal is being carried out as a savior. The mission that was secret and ignored is now the only reason there is a tomorrow for 50 men. The unity of this story is the triumph of the truth over the rules. The smoke from the farmhouse was still rising when Captain Miller found him. Miller walked through the wreckage of the Tiger tanks. He touched the scorched metal of the 88mm guns. He looked at the farmhouse walls that were designed to hide a massacre. He realized with a sickening feeling in his stomach how close he had come to leading his men into a grave. He found Silas in the small foxhole under the pine tree. Silas was pale. His eyes were closed. His jacket was a dark, frozen red. Miller didn't pull out his handcuffs. He didn't call for a military police officer. He knelt in the blood-stained snow and took Silas's hand. "I'm sorry, Vance," the captain whispered. Silas opened his eyes for just a moment. He didn't ask about his rank. He didn't ask about his medal. He looked at the trucks on the road and asked one question. Did they make it? Yes, every single one of them. The aftermath of war is often measured in numbers, but the aftermath of Silas Vance's mission was measured in lives. A month later, in a hospital far from the front lines, Silas Vance sat in a wheelchair. His shoulder was still in bandages. He looked out the window at the rain. He looked like the same quiet man from Kentucky. A high-ranking general walked into the room. He didn't come to arrest Silas. He came to pin a medal on his chest. It was the Silver Star, one of the highest honors a soldier can receive for gallantry in action. The general spoke of bravery and devotion to duty. He spoke of extraordinary heroism, but Silas barely heard the words. He was looking at the door. Standing in the hallway were the men from his unit, the 50 men who had been in that convoy. They weren't laughing or mocking him now. One by one, they walked into the room. They didn't say much, they just shook his hand. Some of them had tears in their eyes. They knew the truth. They knew that a traitor had saved their lives. The story of the ghost of Sector 4 ended that day. Silas went back home to his woods in Kentucky. He never talked much about the war, He didn't show off his medal. He went back to being the quiet man who listened to the birds and watched the wind. But every year, on the anniversary of that cold December night, he would receive 50 letters from 50 different families. They were letters of thanks. They were photos of children and grandchildren who only existed because one man had the courage to be wrong.
History is filled with names we remember, generals, presidents, and kings. But the real history of the world is often made by people like Silas Vance, people who see the truth when no one else does, people who are willing to be labeled a traitor today so that there can be a tomorrow. Because in the end, the man who broke the rules was the only one who truly understood the mission. Thank you for watching this journey into the heart of the Ardennes. If Silas Vance's story inspired you, please hit the like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories of courage with the world. What would you have done if you were in Silas's shoes? Would you have followed orders, or would you have followed your heart? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the shadows of history. Until next time, remember, the loudest voice isn't always the one telling the truth.